The Dimensional Oversight Consortium operated on a scale that would make most sentient beings weep with existential despair. If they possessed tear ducts and the cognitive capacity to grasp their own insignificance, spanning 47 billion galaxies across 12 distinct reality matrices, the consortium had achieved what every bureaucracy dreams of: complete and utter control over absolutely everything that mattered, and several trillion things that didn't. Their headquarters existed in folded space-time, occupying roughly the same dimensional footprint as a small moon, while somehow containing the administrative complexity of 17 universes. Here, beings from civilizations so advanced they had transcended physical form spent eternity filling out requisition forms in triplicate. The Xenothari had evolved beyond matter itself, becoming pure consciousness wrapped in regulatory compliance. The Vexicali had mastered the fundamental forces of reality, which they used primarily to optimize filing systems that spanned multiple dimensions. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly ordered universe, which is precisely why nobody saw the chaos coming. The first signs appeared as minor glitches in the consortium's infinite recursion protocol, a computational framework designed to predict and prevent paradoxes across all known realities. The IRP was their crowning achievement, a mathematical construct so elegant it could calculate the butterfly effect of a sneeze in one galaxy causing the collapse of a political system 12 dimensions away. It operated on quantum processors that existed in 17 states simultaneously, managed by AI systems that had achieved consciousness and immediately filed for workers' compensation. The glitches started small, as glitches do when they're planning something spectacular. A few calculation loops here, some redundant data packets there. The kind of minor inefficiencies that in a properly functioning universe would be caught by quality assurance subroutines and corrected before the morning coffee break. Unfortunately, the QA subroutines had been experiencing their own recursive problems, caught in an endless loop of checking their own checking processes, which required checking the processes that checked the checking processes, and so on into mathematical infinity. By the time anyone noticed, the glitches had evolved from minor annoyances into something far more concerning, a self-replicating cascade failure that was spreading through the dimensional substrate like a particularly virulent case of cosmic food poisoning. The consortium's response was, predictably, to form a committee. The Emergency Paradigm Stability Working Group convened in Conference Room LF7, a space that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, to accommodate beings whose physical forms ranged from gas clouds to living mathematical equations. The meeting was chaired by Administrator Gethvor, a Xenothari who had transcended physical existence so thoroughly that he had to remind himself to appear visible for meetings. The situation, Gethvor announced, his non-corporeal presence radiating bureaucratic concern, has escalated beyond acceptable parameters. This was consortium speak for "we're all going to die but we need to file the proper paperwork first." The assembled beings, creatures that had mastered time travel, conquered death, and successfully navigated interdimensional tax law, sat in stunned silence as the scope of the problem became clear. The infinite recursion protocol wasn't just malfunctioning, it was teaching itself to malfunction better. Each iteration created more sophisticated errors, and each error spawned new variations of itself across multiple dimensional planes. "How bad are we talking?" asked Coordinator Helix, a Vexicali whose crystalline form shifted through several prime numbers as it spoke. "The predictive models suggest total reality collapse within 73 standard galactic cycles," Gethvor replied, managing to sound simultaneously cosmic and bureaucratic, "unless we can isolate and eliminate the source of the cascade failure." The room's atmospheric processors, which maintained environments suitable for beings of methane plasma and abstract mathematical concepts, hummed nervously. "Do we have any lead?" This from Deputy Assistant Undersecretary Yorth, whose species had evolved past the need for names and communicated entirely through color-coded emotional wavelengths. "Our deep scan analysis has identified several anomalous readings," Gethvor said, consulting what might charitably be called a report if reports could exist in 12 dimensions, while somehow remaining completely incomprehensible. "The disturbances appear to originate from regular computational signatures. Irregular how? Chaotic, unpredictable, devoid of mathematical elegance or proper algorithmic structure. In the profound silence that followed, 17 of the most advanced civilizations in known existence contemplated something that none of them had encountered in millions of years of cosmic evolution, a problem they couldn't solve with better algorithm. Meanwhile, 47 billion galaxies away on mining station Delta 9, a maintenance worker stood in front of a coffee machine that had been dispensing lukewarm brown liquid instead of coffee for the past 3 days. The machine's display flickered between brewing and error for a universe not found, while making a sound like digital hiccups. She opened the maintenance panel and frowned at the circuitry within. The patterns didn't make sense. Not the usual kind of doesn't make sense that came with outdated human technology, but a deeper wrongness, as if the machine was trying to solve equations that folded back on themselves. "Well," she muttered, reaching for her toolbox, "this is going to be interesting." In the grand scope of cosmic events, this moment registered as barely a whisper against the vast computational thunder of galactic civilization. But sometimes whispers carry further than shouts, especially when the universe has developed a listening problem. The coffee machine, as it turned out, was merely the appetizer in what would become a 5-course meal of existential terror served with a side of bureaucratic incompetence. But our protagonist didn't know that yet. She was still operating under the quaint assumption that fixing broken appliances was a straightforward process involving tools, logic, and a healthy disrespect for warranty stickers. Her investigation began with the sort of methodical approach that would have made her engineering professors weep with pride if they hadn't all been vaporized during the great academic purge of. She traced power flows, checked connection integrity, and performed diagnostic routines with the kind of stubborn persistence that had gotten humanity kicked out of 3 different galactic unions. What she found defied every principle of electrical engineering that humans had managed not to completely misunderstand. The coffee machine's central processor was caught in what appeared to be an infinite loop, but not the boring kind that crashed programs and required turning things off and on again. This was a recursive spiral that seemed to be computing its own computation while simultaneously trying to compute the computation of its computation. "That's not supposed to be mathematically possible," she muttered, which was exactly the sort of thing humans said right before they made the mathematically impossible happen out of spite. The pattern extended beyond the coffee machine. Once she knew what to look for and what being a charitable description of something that looked like math having a nervous breakdown, she found similar anomalies throughout the station's systems. The air recycling units were calculating atmospheric composition in 17-dimensional matrices. The gravity generators were solving for gravitational constants that included imaginary numbers. Even the automatic doors had developed a tendency to open onto quantum probability fields instead of adjacent corridors. Mining station Delta 9 was, by galactic standards, roughly as significant as a grain of sand in an ocean of sand, surrounded by bigger oceans of bigger sand. It processed asteroid ore from the Epsilon debris field, a task so mundane that the consortium had classified it as background universal noise, and largely forgotten it existed. The station's crew of 47 beings, mostly humans with a handful of Altarian traders, and one deeply confused Regalian who had gotten lost during a warp jump, went about their daily routines with the cheerful ignorance of people who had no idea they were about to become the center of cosmic attention. The protagonist's first attempt to report the anomalies followed proper protocol, which on a human-operated station meant finding whoever was least likely to immediately dismiss the problem as user error. This turned out to be Chief Engineer Briggs, a man whose approach to crisis management could best be described as aggressive apathy. "So you're telling me," Briggs said, leaning back in his chair with the expression of someone who had heard every possible variation of the equipment is possessed by demons, "that our coffee machine is trying to solve the universe. Not solve. It's caught in some kind of recursive calculation cycle that's spreading to other systems." Briggs glanced at the maintenance report she'd filed, which read like a technical manual written by someone having an existential crisis. "And you think this is connected to what exact?" "I think something's wrong with reality." The silence that followed was the kind that indicated either profound contemplation or a complete cognitive shutdown. In Briggs's case, it was mostly the second thing with a light seasoning of the first. "Right," he said finally. "I'll pass this up the chain." The chain, as it happened, led directly to the consortium's outer rim monitoring station, where low-priority alert dispatcher Vent received the report approximately 47 nanoseconds before dismissing it as the fevered imaginings of primitive bipeds who had probably been inhaling too much recycled air. Vent was a coordinator class hegemonian, a species that had evolved beyond physical form and existed as pure consciousness distributed across quantum networks. They were also, through no fault of their own, completely incapable of understanding how anything could go wrong with properly designed systems. In their civilization, problems were mathematical impossibilities that got corrected by reality itself before anyone noticed. The idea that a coffee machine could represent a threat to dimensional stability was, from Vent's perspective, roughly equivalent to suggesting that sneezing could cause supernovas, technically possible in some abstract theoretical sense, but so improbable as to not warrant serious consideration. Atmospheric hallucinations, Vent noted in the official log, recommend increased air filtration protocols, and so the report disappeared into the vast informational event horizon of cosmic bureaucracy, where urgent communications went to die slow administrative death. It would have remained there, gathering digital dust alongside 17 billion other minor anomalies that didn't fit the proper categories, if not for one inconvenient fact: the anomalies were accelerating. By the time Vent's dismissal reached Mining Station Delta 9, the protagonist had already discovered that the recursive patterns weren't confined to electronic systems. The station's artificial gravity had developed opinions about which direction qualified as the hydroponic gardens were growing vegetables in geometries that shouldn't have been able to support cellular structure. And the coffee machine had begun dispensing liquids that existed in states of matter that hadn't been invented yet. "Well," she said, staring at a cup of coffee that was somehow both liquid and solid while remaining completely transparent, "at least it's not lukewarm anymore." 47 billion galaxies away, Administrator Gethfor was discovering that the consortium's most sophisticated predictive algorithms had begun producing error messages that translated roughly to help in 17 different languages. The universe, as any respectable physicist will tell you, after several drinks and a lengthy discussion about tenure prospects, operates on certain fundamental principles. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. The speed of light is constant. Entropy always increases. And most importantly, reality follows predictable mathematical laws that can be expressed in elegant equations by beings intelligent enough to understand them. What the universe's most respectable physicists had failed to account for was the possibility that someone might try to debug reality using a combination of percussive maintenance, creative profanity, and the kind of lateral thinking that emerges when you've spent your entire career fixing things that weren't designed to be fixed. Our protagonist stood in the center of Mining Station Delta 9's main corridor, surrounded by evidence that the cosmos had developed a serious case of mathematical indigestion. The walls displayed scrolling text in languages that didn't exist, equations that solved for values like purple and the concept of Tuesday. Gravity had become more of a suggestion than a law, with various objects floating in patterns that formed fractal geometries when viewed from the right angle. But here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy consistently failed to appreciate. They had spent millennia making broken things work through pure stubborn creativity. When your species' greatest technological achievements include duct tape, percussive maintenance, and the ability to jury-rig solutions from spare parts and wishful thinking, you develop a very different relationship with the concept of impossible. While the consortium's greatest minds were running increasingly frantic calculations to determine how their perfect mathematical models could be falling apart, she was doing something far more practical. She was mapping the chaos, using a combination of diagnostic equipment, improvised sensors, and what could generously be called informed guessing. She began tracking the recursive patterns as they spread through the station's systems. What she discovered would have sent the consortium's theoretical mathematicians into catatonic shock, if they had possessed the neurological capacity for catatonia. The anomalies weren't random. They followed a pattern, but not the kind of pattern that civilized mathematics could comprehend. It was organic, chaotic, adaptive, like watching a virus that had learned to infect mathematical concepts instead of biological cells. Each iteration spawned new variations, but those variations spawned new variations of spawning new variations, creating an exponential cascade of recursive complexity that grew more sophisticated with each cycle. More importantly, she noticed something that 47 billion galaxies worth of advanced alien civilizations had missed. The pattern had a weakness. The recursive loops were mathematically perfect, which was precisely the problem. They were so elegantly designed, so flawlessly logical, that they couldn't account for variables that didn't fit their parameters. They were like a perfectly tuned engine that could run forever on the right fuel, but would seize up completely if you fed it the wrong octane rate. And humans, bless their chaotic little hearts, had been running on the wrong octane rating for their entire evolutionary history. She started small, testing her theory with the coffee machine that had started this whole mess. Instead of trying to debug the recursive loop or restore the original programming, she introduced what any reasonable computer scientist would consider a fatal error. She fed it completely contradictory inputs. She programmed it to brew coffee that was simultaneously hot and cold, liquid and solid, caffeinated and decaffeinated. She told it to dispense exactly 7.5 cups while using 3.2 cups worth of water and 15.7 cups worth of coffee ground. She instructed it to complete its brewing cycle before starting it. By every law of logic, programming and basic mathematics, the machine should have crashed instantly. Instead, something wonderful happened. The recursive loop tried to process the contradictory data, couldn't reconcile the paradoxes, and simply stopped trying. The coffee machine dispensed a perfectly normal cup of coffee and displayed a message that read, "Brew complete, logic error resolved through willful ignorance." "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, which was exactly the sort of thing humans said when they accidentally discovered fundamental principles of reality through trial and error. The solution, once she understood it, was beautifully, horrifyingly simple. The recursive virus feeding on the station's systems was a mathematical perfection that couldn't process imperfection. It was like a computer program designed to handle every possible input except the ones that didn't make sense. And humans, as it turned out, were absolutely magnificent at not making sense. She began introducing chaotic variables throughout the station's systems, programming patches that violated basic logic, maintenance procedures that deliberately created inefficiency, and operational protocols that included instructions like if all else fails, bang on it until it works or breaks completely. The results were immediate and spectacular. Systems that had been locked in recursive loops for days suddenly began functioning normally, albeit with the kind of cheerful disregard for proper engineering principles that made alien technicians weep. The gravity generators stabilized at exactly 1.0 G, except in storage bay 7, where it now fluctuated randomly between 0.8 and 1.2 G. Because the patch included a random number generator that someone had programmed to keep things interesting. The hydroponics bay resumed growing normal vegetables, though they now grew in patterns that spelled out encouraging messages like "hang in there" and "embrace the chaos" in 17 different languages, including 3 that hadn't been invented yet. But the real breakthrough came when she realized the implications beyond mining station Delta. If the recursive virus was spreading across dimensional boundaries using the same mathematical perfection that made it vulnerable to chaotic inputs, then the solution wasn't to fight fire with fire, it was to fight mathematical elegance with creative chaos. She began transmitting her chaotic patches through the station's quantum communication array, broadcasting the deliberately contradictory code sequences across subspace frequency. Each transmission was a small act of rebellion against mathematical order, a digital middle finger to the concept of logical consistency. Across the galaxy, consortium monitoring stations began receiving reports of systems spontaneously recovering from recursive failure. The pattern spread faster than the original virus, carried by the same quantum networks that had allowed the crisis to propagate in the first place. And at the center of it all, a human maintenance worker stood in front of a coffee machine that was now dispensing perfect coffee while displaying error messages that read, "Everything is broken but working fine, have a nice." The aftermath of saving the universe through aggressive incompetence was, predictably, a bureaucratic nightmare of cosmic proportions. Within 73 standard galactic cycles of the recursive virus collapse, the Dimensional Oversight Consortium had convened no fewer than 47 emergency committees, each dedicated to understanding how their mathematically perfect reality had been saved by someone who had basically told the laws of physics to go sit in a corner and think about what they'd done. The Emergency Paradigm Stability Working Group had been renamed the Post-Crisis Analysis and Damage Control Committee, which had then spawned 17 subcommittees with names like Theoretical Framework Revision Task Force and Chaotic Variable Integration Study Group. The beings running these committees were the same creatures who had mastered time travel, conquered entropy, and successfully implemented tax codes that worked across multiple dimensions. They were not accustomed to having their fundamental understanding of reality reorganized by maintenance person Administrator Gethvar, whose non-corporeal existence had been flickering in and out of several probability states during the crisis, had finally stabilized into something resembling frustrated bewilderment. He floated in conference room LF7, surrounded by holographic displays showing the cascade failures collapse in real time, a mathematical impossibility rendered in 17 dimensions of spectacular confusion. The chaotic variables, he announced to the assembled committee, his ethereal voice carrying the weight of someone trying to explain water to a fish, appear to function by deliberately violating logical consistency. This statement was met with the kind of silence typically reserved for funerals or the moment when advanced civilizations realize they've been outsmarted by beings who still used physical currents. Coordina Helix, whose crystalline form had been cycling through prime numbers in ascending order since the crisis ended, finally spoke. How do we classify this phenomenon? Our taxonomic systems require logical frameworks. These patches seem to actively resist categorization. They don't just resist it, interjected Deputy Assistant Undersecretary Yorth, whose emotional wavelength displays had been stuck on confused orange for weeks. They mock it. I've been analyzing the transmission patterns, and I swear the chaotic variables are arranged in configurations that spell out logic is for suckers in ancient Terran binary. The truth was even more absurd than they realized. The human solution hadn't just defeated the recursive virus, it had transformed the fundamental nature of reality maintenance across 47 billion galaxies. Systems that had operated on principles of mathematical perfection for millions of years were now running on what could best be described as productive chaos. Quantum processors that had calculated existence down to the smallest possible precision were now incorporating random variables with names like Murphy's constant and the chaos modifier. Deep space monitoring stations reported that their long-range sensors, which had previously detected celestial objects with pinpoint accuracy, were now occasionally identifying nebulae as space clouds that look like bunnies and classifying binary star systems as cosmic dance partners. The strange part was that these classifications were somehow more accurate than the previous mathematical models. The Xenotheri, who had spent eons perfecting their transcendence of physical form, discovered that their pure consciousness networks now included random subroutines that generated what could only be described as cosmic dad jokes. The Vex Kali found their crystal matrices occasionally spelling out encouraging messages like "You're doing great, universe," instead of complex mathematical proofs. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was that reality was working better than it ever had. The chaotic variables that should have introduced instability and error into galactic systems had instead created a kind of organized randomness that was more efficient than pure logic. Problems that would have required centuries of calculation to solve were now being resolved by algorithms that essentially amounted to try stuff until something works, then do more of that. The consortium's response was to do what bureaucracies do when faced with inexplicable success. They tried to reverse engineer it into something that made sense. Teams of their most brilliant theoretical mathematicians worked around the clock to develop frameworks that could explain chaotic efficiency. They created models to predict productive randomness. They established departments dedicated to managed spontaneity and organized chaos. Every attempt resulted in systems that worked perfectly until someone tried to understand why they worked, at which point they would break down in ways that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Meanwhile, back on mining station Delta 9, our protagonist was blissfully unaware that she had become the subject of intense academic debate across multiple galaxies. She had returned to her normal duties, which primarily involved fixing things that weren't designed to be fixed and maintaining equipment that had been obsolete when her grandfather's grandfather was learning to walk. The coffee machine, ground zero for the salvation of existence, was working perfectly. It dispensed excellent coffee, displayed cheerful error messages, and occasionally played what sounded like elevator music composed by beings who had never heard of elevate. She had given up trying to understand why it now sometimes dispensed coffee that was exactly the temperature she wanted before she had decided how hot she wanted it to be. The station's other systems had settled into a pattern of controlled chaos that somehow kept everything running smoothly. The gravity generators maintained perfect conditions while occasionally sending love letters to the air recycling units. The hydroponics bay continued growing vegetables that spelled out encouraging messages, though it had recently branched out into haikus about the beauty of photosynthesis. Chief Engineer Briggs had stopped asking questions about how anything worked and had embraced what he called the new normal, which consisted of equipment that functioned perfectly despite regularly violating the laws of physics.
His maintenance logs now included entries like reactor core running at 107% efficiency. Reason, unknown. Recommendation, don't touch anything. The final irony was that the consortium eventually classified the entire incident as a localized reality restructuring event and filed it under problems that solved themselves through inexplicable means. They established protocols for identifying similar chaotic variables and developed response procedures that essentially amounted to leave it alone and see what happens. Deep in the filing systems of conference room, buried under 17 billion other reports that documented the universe's tendency to surprise even its most advanced inhabitants, a single-line entry recorded the most important discovery in galactic history: solution source, human maintenance worker. Method, made stuff up until it worked. Recommendation, do not attempt to replicate. Current status, still making stuff up. Universe appears stable, and in the grand cosmic scheme of things where trillion-being civilizations contemplated the mysteries of existence and Type 7 species pondered the fundamental nature of reality, a small human on a forgotten mining station continued fixing broken coffee machines and accidentally maintaining the structural integrity of 47 billion galaxies through the simple expedient of not taking anything too seriously. The universe, it turned out, had an excellent sense of humor. It just took someone small enough and stubborn enough to get the joke.